Hello students, Professor Metzger here. This video will provide a brief review for the final exam. I've enjoyed working with all of you this semester. It has been a complete honor to be your instructor, and I really hope you learned something about American history and remember why it's important. If you're concerned about your grade before going into the final, please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions or concerns during office hours or schedule an appointment. The final exam is the same structure as the midterm, 45 multiple choice and 5 true and false questions. The exam covers the Cold War primarily and the final stages of the Second World War through chapters 31 of the textbook, so chapters 27 to 31 respectively. I've included a list of key terms and a few sample questions. The major things to be aware of for the final exam are the key developments, causes, and results of the Cold War. What had happened at the end of World War II is really based on the old adage of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Once Nazi Germany, militarist Japan, and fascist Italy were defeated, the United States and the Soviet Union no longer had a common foe. Consequently, they started to compete for influence not only in Europe, but the developing third world, countries like Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Asiatic countries, China, Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and Korea respectively. This led to the United States to be concerned that any country aligned with the Soviet Union could undermine American influence throughout the world. This led to a series of diplomatic efforts and foreign policy approaches that lasted several decades. The United States was a capitalist free market society, whereas the Soviet Union was controlled by a communist leadership, which really undermined individual and personal freedom in that country. One thing the United States really became concerned with was the policy that was advocated by George Kennan. Though the main author of the containment strategy concept and how it was applied throughout the Cold War, George Kennan was the preeminent Soviet expert and understood Russian history as well. Therefore, he advocated a patient and long-term approach towards the Soviet Union. He said the United States needed to use diplomacy, but at the same time be prepared to use its military to prevent, if need be, a direct confrontation against the Soviet Union, but ensure our allies would not fall to communist control and communist dictatorships. This was the concern. This led to other politicians, primarily Winston Churchill, to proclaim that an Iron Curtain had divided Europe following World War II. Understand there was a large-scale polarization in the major geographic areas throughout the world during the Cold War. You had a divided Germany, for instance. The German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, with its capital at Berlin, and the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, with its headquarters and capital at Bonn. However, even though Berlin was in East Germany and really aligned with the Soviet Union, it was jointly administered between the Soviets in East Berlin and the French, British, and Americans in West Berlin. You could almost say that this was a powder keg waiting to go off. Luckily for us, it never did happen, the Third World War, and that's why the Cold War was called just that. There was a series of proxy wars between the allies of the US and the Soviet Union, but luckily for us, there was never a direct nuclear war between the two superpowers, and this is one of many reasons why the Cold War is still significant to this day. This led President Truman to understand and kind of push the concept of a domino theory, that if one country, the domino theory originally applied to Greece and Turkey, that if Greece fell to communist influence, all the other countries in the area would fall like a row of dominoes, and the Soviet Union would assert its control and hegemony over the area. Be aware of the Marshall Plan and the ways in which that George Marshall really did use the economic power to coincide with American military might to undermine Soviet appeal. There were billions of dollars appropriated under the Marshall Plan to really prevent Western European countries from falling to communism. And this was an overwhelming success, the Marshall Plan as a whole, and really aligned West Berlin and Western European countries more to the area and control of the United States against the Soviet Union. Understand the causes and results of the Berlin airlift. Ultimately, what happened, the Soviets closed road and rail traffic in June 1948 between East and West Berlin. Many feared the beginning of World War III. However, a massive airlift, primarily under the auspices of the United States and the Royal Air Force of the British, really kept the German civilians, who were actually previous enemies, clothed and fed for the entire winter of 1948 to 1949, and eventually by May 1949 the Soviets reopened road and rail traffic. One reason why this was a success, the Berlin airlift, was because the National Security Act of 47 had created the CIA, the Department of Defense, and now an independent Air Force which challenged the power of the Soviet Army. This was pretty significant in the development of the Cold War. Also know how National Security Council 68, the document which called for massive military defense increases and to prevent Soviet control and takeover of any primarily European or even Asiatic country, set the tone for foreign policy, really building on the kind of foundation set by the containment policy. And National Security Council document 68 was actually authored by Paul Nitze. Understand how 1949, with the creation of NATO, was an important year in the Cold War. The Soviet Union had actually attained nuclear weapons in 1949. On October 1st, 1949, the People's Republic of China was established. This was a direct challenge to the domino theory. This was a direct challenge to the containment policy. And Article 5 of NATO actually states that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all. This still is a significant linchpin, you could call it, to American foreign policy. Understand the polarization of not only the Korean Peninsula, but the causes, the main battles, and the results of the Korean War. Understand that General Douglas MacArthur launched a massive amphibious assault on Incheon on September 15, 1950, and allowed the United States to push back, even though the sides would change several times on the 38th parallel, north and south of it, that it would change hands several times. This did prevent an absolute takeover by North Korean Communist forces and China once they intervened later in the fall of 1950. Many historians say that war usually acts as a catalyst for social change, and the Cold War was no different. Be aware of the ways in which that the Cold War really did impact life back here in the United States. Within the context of the Second Red Scare, the fear of a communist takeover, the Alger Hiss case, how he was actually convicted of lying to the House Un-American Activities Committee or perjury before Congress for his relationship with Whittaker Chambers and hiding documents many believed he had actually given to the Soviet Union. Understand the role of Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, and the concept of McCarthyism. You know, many in the United States used the Red Scare, the Second Red Scare, to really bolster their political careers, to use it as a springboard for their political careers. And Joseph McCarthy was best known for accusing the State Department in 1950 of being filled with communists. He would also make later accusations against the United States Army and hundreds of its officers, which none of these accusations were actually founded, could be proved. It was all just simply an effort by McCarthy to improve his own political power. Also understand how the accusations made by McCarthy, the House Un-American Activities Committee, coincided with the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for espionage or spying, and actually providing, in the case of Julius Rosenberg, atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, which allowed them to develop their atomic bomb by 1949. Understand the significance of the Federal Aid and Highway Act of 1956. What this ultimately did was build many of the interstates all of us still use in our individual lives. I-95, I-75. If you're unfortunate enough to actually have to drive on some of those interstates nowadays, they were founded within the context of the need for really mobilizing and evacuating civilians from major cities if they were attacked by the Soviet Union within and during the Cold War. Understand the beats. Be aware of Jack Kerouac, On the Road, one of the best known beat generations. The beats were known as such because they were sick of, quote, being beaten down. They challenged the mainstream society of the United States in the post-war period. They said there has to be more to life than living in suburbia, than, having a two-car household. While the husband goes off to work in the city, the wife is best seen during the 1950s as the preeminent housewife, the kind of manager of the household, and how the beats, rock and roll, and many other changes like civil rights challenged mainstream America. Know that Brown v. Board of Education actually undermined and changed the separate but equal clause going back to 1896, and how many Southern politicians responded by pledging, quote, massive resistance against federal measures of integration. Understand the major presidential elections, the changes in the political party since 1948, and a lot of the foreign and domestic changes since 1948. Understand the role of the Bay of Pigs. It was an absolute embarrassment for the Kennedy administration, and it actually pushed the USSR and Cuba closer together. It was a failed attempt to use Cuban nationals trained by the CIA to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro, which ultimately failed and led to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the Soviets started to install atomic missiles on the island of Cuba pointed directly at the United States. Luckily for us, primarily in Florida, Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev really worked out a diplomatic exchange that we pledged not to invade Cuba. We would remove our Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy as long as the Soviet Union removed their missiles from Cuba. This was the closest the world ever came to the Third World War, and luckily for us, it did not happen. Understand the main causes, the battles, and the results of the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin, the disputed attacks against American vessels, which later the National Security Agency, Council, and the Navy have actually come out and said there was no second attack at the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, but how it actually authorized Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th president, to take all necessary measures to repel armed aggression against the United States. This opened up a power vacuum in Vietnam, because heretofore Kennedy had used thousands of, quote, advisors to simply advise the South Vietnamese forces against the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese Regular Army. And the United States government had told the American people during Vietnam that victory was at the end of the tunnel. Light was at the end of the tunnel. However, the Tet Offensive, which was launched at the end of January, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, really challenged what the Johnson administration was telling the American people. And please understand that for those Americans, the over 50,000 that lost their lives in Vietnam, they served for the most part with distinction and honor. And the war in Vietnam, if it was lost, it's for you to decide. It was most likely lost by the politicians back here in the United States, both Republican and Democrat respectively. Understand the major leaders of the civil rights movement, and how some Southern politicians like the governor of Alabama, Governor George Wallace, said that he would take a stand in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama to prevent integration. Understand primarily the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, Title IX, how it applied to higher education, and the major impetus for the Great Society, like Michael Harrington's book called The Other America, published in 1962, which really pushed President Johnson, to proclaim an unconditional war against poverty. Understand the major social and political developments and movements of the 1960s, the Young Americans for Freedom. This was actually a conservative student movement, and the more progressive Students for a Democratic Society. Understand the hippies and the yippies, what they stood for, how they changed American life, and Henry Kissinger, primarily when it came to the Nixon administration, understand how Nixon was influenced by Henry Kissinger, primarily when it came to his détente policy with the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, and how it applied to Vietnam and the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. For the Watergate scandal, understand that Nixon was not actually wrapped up in the initial break-in at the Watergate Hotel and offices in 1972. However, Nixon resigned in August 1974 to spare himself the trial in the Senate. And just briefly, let's take a moment here to take a look at the sample questions. They will appear on the test. And here we go. Which of the following is true of the Civil Rights Act of '64? Well, what it did is it outlawed segregation in public facilities on the basis of race, sex, or national origin. Gender was one main aspect of the Civil Rights Act of '64. Again, the main battles, one of which of the Korean War, Incheon was the site during the Korean War where Douglas MacArthur turned the Korean War around with an amphibious landing on September 15, 1950. And again, there was that back and forth motion across the 38th parallel, and the war would eventually result in an armistice, a ceasefire, in 1953. And the Korean War is kind of still going on to this day between North and South, and the role of the United States in the diplomatic overtures and efforts to bring peace to the peninsula. Number 3, what had happened in South Vietnam by the end of 1975 following the Paris Peace Accords? Ultimately, what happened is once the United States pulled out in '73, the North Vietnamese troops gained the upper hand over South Vietnam, successfully invading and capturing Saigon. And Saigon was thereafter renamed Ho Chi Minh City, a unified Vietnam under communist control. And number 4 gives you an idea of some of the long-winded nature of some of the questions, but again, as long as you keep up with the readings and the key terms, it should be pretty straightforward. What were among the main U.S. foreign policy concerns following the Second World War, and why? Well, with the elimination of German Nazism, the United States and the Soviet Union no longer seemed to share a united goal. The power vacuums in Europe and Asia due to the defeat of the Germans and Japanese left the Americans and Soviets competing for global influence. Number 5 we have here, drawing on the assumption of the domino theory, President Truman believed the Soviet and communist activities in Greece would allow for the fall of the other nations in Eastern Mediterranean, followed by those in Western Europe, if unchecked. That again, if Greece and Turkey fell to communist control, that all the other countries in the region would do so, and this set the tone for American foreign policy for decades. Number 6, understand not only the significance of the election of 1960, the first televised election in American history that really allowed John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or Jack as he preferred to be called, to defeat Richard Nixon. Because, you know, Kennedy was known more so for his good looks, his demeanor, whereas Nixon was known for some shady kind of previous and future political, tumultuousness, to say the least. And this ties into Kennedy's stance on civil rights, to say the least. Because much like his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, which would change things when it came to the Democratic Party in the South, Kennedy, the 35th president, was concerned, much like Truman had been, FDR, that if they came out and took a definitive stance of civil rights, that they would alienate a lot of people in the South, primarily the white Democrats in the South that controlled the congressional committees. Therefore, you have to understand that Kennedy celebrated racial equality but was reluctant to promote it himself due to the fear of alienating potential political allies, particularly conservative Democrats in the South. And this is the final one, a sample of the true and false questions. As I previously pointed out, the year 1949 saw both the communists take control of China and the Soviets' development of an atomic bomb. True or false? This is absolutely true. It coincided with the development of NATO and the further polarization of not only Asiatic countries like Korea and the domino theory applying to China therein, but primarily Europe and a lot of countries in the Western Hemisphere. I know it's been a kind of longer review than I intended, but there was an awful lot of material to cover. I genuinely hope that, again, you enjoyed the class. I did the best as I could as an instructor, and I really hope you learned something. Again, don't hesitate to contact me with any questions or concerns, primarily before the exam, before the grades get turned in. I appreciate your time. All the best.